Were the days of Genesis 1, the days of creation, literal 24-hour periods? Or were they long extended periods of eons of time and millions of years? After all, the word day, it can be translated in up to 7 different ways. And on rare occasions, it can refer to a period of time longer than 24 hours. How long were the days of the creation week? Could it be the case that the creation was 7 long eons of billions of years? Well, the truth is, there's simply no way to determine the meaning of a word unless we look at the word in the context in which it's used. It's interesting to discover the context of Genesis chapter 1 and to understand and learn that that context demands that the days of creation were literal 24-hour periods. Let's see what the author of Genesis did in the context to demand that conclusion. You see, he went out of his way to make that idea clear. Here are the reasons we know that. First, the author defined the word day, which is the Hebrew word yom, for the reader by saying that it was composed of an evening and a morning. You see, that's the exact rotation of the earth being described by the phrase evening and morning. And that's the way that the Hebrew language describes a literal day. So you have the word yom, the word day, and it's used there in the creation week in Genesis chapter 1. And then every time it says, and there was evening and morning, day 1. Evening and morning, day 2. Evening and morning, day 3. So that qualifying statement, evening and morning. Now, second, whenever a number comes before the word day in the Old Testament, in non-prophetic literature like Genesis or Exodus, it always means a literal 24-hour period. Notice that in Genesis chapter 1, each day is marked with a number. An evening and a morning, day 1. An evening and a morning, day 2. Now, we understand how this is used. If someone were to say, back in my day, well, that's a vague, it doesn't mean 24 hours. But if someone were then to say, on the second day, on the third day, on the fourth day, you see what the difference there is. The context is qualifying and adding a numeric statement that shows it's a literal 24-hour period. And third, whenever the word day appears in its plural form, yamim, in non-prophetic literature like Genesis and Exodus, it always means a literal 24-hour day. In fact, it's used hundreds of ways and hundreds of times in the Old Testament, and when it is in its plural form, it always means a literal 24-hour day in non-prophetic literature. Therefore, when we read in Exodus chapter 20, verse 11, for in 6 days, Yamim, the Lord made the heavens and the earth, there can be absolutely no doubt that the text demands a literal 24-hour day in this instance. Now, fourth, the author of Genesis had other ways to indicate to the reader if he wanted to say the days were long extended eons of time, he could have used a word that would have indicated that. He could have used the word dor, the Hebrew word, and that would have shown that there were long periods of time and not individual 24-hour days. But that's not what he did. In fact, not only did he not use a word that would be a long extended period of eons of time, but he used the word day, qualified it with an evening and a morning, put numbers in front of each one of those, and used it in its plural form in Exodus chapter 20, verse 11. What more could the author have done to qualify the meaning of the word and show us that the days of creation were not long extended periods of millions of years, but were literal 24-hour days? You see, this idea and understanding precludes the idea that there were billions of years that would have allowed for some type of evolution to go on during the creation week. But what about 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 8, someone will say? You see, there the text says, but with the Lord 1 day is as 1,000 years, and 1,000 years as 1 day. Doesn't that mean a day could be a long extended period of time? Well, no, that's not what that passage means at all. All it was saying is that God made a promise to send Christ back, and that promise wasn't going to be altered by the amount of time between when He made it and when He brought that to reality. If He made it a day ago, or if He made it 2,000 years ago, it was still just as binding. And notice that the text there says that with the Lord, 1 day is as 1,000 years, and 1,000 years as 1 day. It doesn't say 1 day is 1,000 years, or 1,000 years is 1 day. Finally, why in the world are we talking about the 6 days of creation? Couldn't God have made the world in 6 seconds? Sure. What about 6 nanoseconds or 6 picoseconds? Could God have done it that quickly? Yes, He could have if He wanted to, but the text tells us He used 6 days. In Exodus chapter 20, verse 11, Moses explains to the Israelites, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor, but the 7th day is the Sabbath. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens, the earth, and seas, and all that is in them, and rested the 7th. This passage clearly presents the idea that the days could not have been millions of years. God created the universe in 6 days, and He rested 1 day. Why? To give humanity a pattern for a 7-day week. There's no natural cycle that gives us that. There's no moon cycle or earth rotation cycle that marks a 7-day week pattern, and yet virtually every human society has used a 7-day week from the beginning of human history. Why is that? Because God chose to create the world in 6 literal, normal, 24-hour work days, and He stopped creating on that 7th day of the week. The days of creation were literal 24-hour days.